Hey guys, Happy New Year and welcome back. You might think it's a little late for New Year's, but I've been working on this project since December, so it's still relevant to me. Today, we'll be building something that's been requested on every single PC build I've done so far. Can you guess what it is? Noctuas. While many may think my PC cases are ideal pairings with Noctua parts, in reality, the woods I used in the past don't really match the Noctua brown and beige. Noctua's brown is actually very reddish, which is not common in timber, so off to the lumberyard. I brought the fans with me to hunt for the perfect matches. The blokes were really helpful in my odd search. In the warehouse lighting, you can really see the vast variety of browns available, and most of them clash with the Noctua colors. Another thing to note is Noctua currently has two different tones of beige and brown. Their older fan beige has a yellow undertone, while newer models have a pinkish hue. I had to look for the woods that would suit both best. The colors also look different depending on the light conditions, which didn't make this any easier. This white ash matched the frame really well. This red gum matched the brown. Off camera, I found better matches for both. US Hickory for the beige and Australian Jara for the brown. Let's prep the board and take note for any defects. We will definitely avoid using these parts in the final build. Before cutting anything, I wanted to test the part layouts first. The critical hole positions were extracted from CAD and scored onto a scrap MDF panel. Parts were then mounted together with any custom brackets to verify their design. Hole placement looked good overall. There were some minor adjustments which I updated in the CAD before proceeding. We then need to join two boards together to get the width of the rear panel. Grain flow is important when jointing boards. To get an appearance of a singular board, the grain flow should not clash and intersect. Instead, find an orientation that allows the grain to flow smoothly as shown. Next, we need to make the mating surfaces dead flat. Thanks to DJ for this vintage hand plane, which I used to flatten the edges. That's much better. We then clamp the boards with mating faces outwards and plane the edges together to get a perfect fit. Doing this will account for any minor tilts you introduce during the planing process. Now that's a tight-fitting joint. Clamps, baking paper, and taped blocks are prepared ahead of glue up. Liberal amounts of glue is applied to each edge. Excess is wiped off with a damp rag. The taped blocks are used to press the boards flat. The tape prevents the glue from sticking to these blocks. Once dry, the excess glue is chiseled and planed off. After final sanding, you can barely tell where the joint was. Great result. Now the board is trimmed to exact width while avoiding a knot present, followed by trimming to length. The rear panel template was printed on 2 sheets of paper due to its size. I printed each half with overlapping holes and used these to pin the sheets together. Then they are taped and cut out. Hole positions are then punched. When I moved to the drill press, I noticed that it could not reach most of the holes due to the depth of the design. To get around this, I made a quick drilling guide by drilling from both sides of a scrap hardwood piece. Holes were then started freehand for the bit to have a resting hole, then the guide was used to the appropriate depth. For true holes on the panel where positioning is critical, I flipped and marked the positions from the other face and drilled from both sides to ensure they are spot on. "13mm holes were then drilled in opposing corners for the larger openings. These openings were cut 2mm smaller than required. Plywood pieces was then glued around them to form a routing template. Using a pattern following bit gives us a much cleaner opening compared to a jigsaw. Corners were filed sharp where required. This process was repeated for all the openings needed. I used multiple pieces of scrap plywood to create templates rather than cutting each shape on the laser to minimize wastage. On this cut, I went too aggressive and the router took a chunk out. I quickly filled it back with superglue and sawdust. Rinse and repeat. Edges were also chamfered. On to the CNC. I attached the whole rear panel to the CNC, which barely fit. In fact, the panel was so large I was not able to close the enclosure during machining. First, the outline of the cut was engraved to check if I had positioned the panel square with the machine. Looked good, so let's get cutting. First, we use a 1-inch bit to machine a shallow indent. A smaller bit follows to clear out the tight radius. Then it carves away the cable raceways. Finally, all the edges are chamfered for a clean finish. I also decided to add this extra indent, which I will explain its purpose later during assembly. Machine marks were sanded and any rough edges smoothed over. To cover the end grain of the rear panel, I decided to add a top strip. This was glued in and the excess trimmed off. The panel was then clamped against the wall and the top strip was planed to the desired thickness. All the work thus far has been on the rear panel alone. This puts into perspective the magnitude of this project. Anyways, let's get a start on the rest of the frame. Remaining jara is cut to length. A thin slither is sliced from the board at this stage in case I need some thin stock later. It's easier to cut when the board is still wide. Quick tip, if the saw clashes with the clamps, you can move them back behind the saw as you progress through the cut. Next comes the grooves for the fan panel. Remember to check your groove positioning before committing to the whole length. I had to readjust here. Now the board is cut to final width. 4mm outer chamfer, then miter cuts to length. For the last piece, there is not enough length to clamp the square for the saw, so I trimmed to final length using a flush cut router instead. Then, each piece is given a glass groove on their edge. Next, the windows are cut. Just like the rear panel, I rough cut them smaller and finish them on the CNC to get a clean edge. The mating edges were done using saw and chisel. The complementary notch in the rear panel is cut using this as a reference. Now we need to bevel the opposing edges of the windows for maximum airflow. As you can see, if we leave the edges as is, the top gap disappears. Same goes for the bottom. The bevels were cut using saw and chisel. For the top frame, the mating notch would be hard to cut using a handsaw, so I used my CNC instead. Followed by chiseling the bulk out. An indent was machined for the Noctua badge. Rest of the hole was drilled out on the press. While cutting the top panel notches, I accidentally cut too deep and had to fill it with superglue and sawdust. It was such a hot day and the afternoon sun was blasting into my west-facing balcony. In a rush to finish up for the day, I drilled the top frame mounting holes incorrectly. After multiple sighs and frustrations, I quickly programmed a CNC operation to cut out some plugs. Plugs were glued in, then sawed flush after drying. A plane cut is used here to protect the panel during cutting. The correct holes were then drilled and transferred onto the mating top frame piece. Threaded inserts can now be added to the top frame. Grooves for the fan mounting and glass were then measured and routed on the rear panel. I then noticed the panel has bowed slightly, probably due to the amount of material removed, releasing some inner stresses in the wood. Damp rags were used to expand the cup side. Before glue up, I prepared the fan mounting panels. Quick coat of clear with gluing edges masked off. The negative scrap was inserted in this notch to support during clamping. Quick tip: always make sure to dry clamp your project. I realized I didn't have long enough clamps and had to buy them and continue the next day. This would have been disastrous if I already applied the glue. Glue up was not my best result, but it was square enough for our tolerance. Gaps in the joints were filled using glue and more sawdust. Bits of dried glue was cleaned up after. top panel sides were screwed in, then the front glued on. After gluing, I noticed the top fan mount was rather flimsy towards the back, so I added a cross brace. 2 coats of matte furniture wax is then applied. When the first coat dried, I noticed these white streaks in some of the areas. My best guess is they came from the powder contained in the gloves. As they were coated with the dried wax, it could not be removed easily. I tried picking away most of it, then sprinkled some charcoal over them to make them less obvious. After applying the second coat, it looked much better. To make the bottom slats, I could have easily used hobby wood panels sold at the local hardware store, but they didn't match the Noctua beige that well. So I decided to make my own 3mm panels. We start by trimming the hickory. The bow was plain flat. Then I took the challenge of manually cutting the 3mm sheet. This honestly took me about 3 hours with my Ryoba saw, and I would not recommend. How I wish I had a bandsaw to do the job. I cut the panel thicker than needed and machined them to final thickness on the CNC. This also removes all the saw marks. Then, the slats are cut out using the laser. I numbered each piece in place to get a consistent grain pattern later. The inner edges of the slats need to be beveled to fit the holders and sit flush with the frame. Same with the front. For the inner edges, I did them manually, but for the front edge, I used a CNC as I wanted them to be cleaner and straight. Remaining charred edges is also sanded off. Slat holders are sanded before gluing onto the frame. A dry fit shows some of the slats were a hair too long, further sanding to get them just right. A coat of wax before gluing them in place. The top panel also needed square rods, which I could have gotten pre-made as well. But again, the colors weren't good enough. To resaw these rods, I decided to use this jig and a circular saw. The jig is clamped to the table and the wood is stuck to the vertical face. Then we resaw with increasing depths. The panel is flipped and repeated as the circular saw can't reach the whole width. Saw marks are machined away, followed by chamfering the ends and pre-cutting the rods. I didn't cut the rods all the way through to make it easier to sand as a single piece. Before separating, I also numbered them in order to keep the grain flow consistent. Edges are finished up with the plane and sander. The top panel is then lasered from Jara plywood and magnet pockets added. A printed spacer was used to get consistent gaps between each rod. Rods are glued in, paying special attention to keep them in the numbered order. A coat of clear and final sand with 1200 grit to get a super smooth finish. A strip of foam was then added around the perimeter of the rear panel to seal against this top panel. I then noticed the top panel sagging in the middle as it was unsupported by the step in the fan. No big deal, printed some shims to fix this. While we are here, the push button is added, followed by gluing on a spacer and the Noctua badge. The badge was wiggling and tilting too much for my liking due to the extra tolerance in the indent. This was unacceptable. I removed the button and printed an oversized plate, which was then sanded to perfectly fit the indent. The badge was glued onto this plate, then back onto the button. Now that's much better. During all this handling, the badge was also scuffed up, so I whipped out my polishing meshes and brought it back to a nice shine. Next, we cut some aluminium channel for the LED strips. One end was filed to allow cable pass-through. Double-sided tape holds the channel in place. The reason I glued the bottom frame in but not the top frame was because I wanted it to be removable for assembly and maintenance. To allow this, the top fans, button and LED strips will need an easy connection point. For the fans, a fan hub is used, but for the LED and button, I had to make a mini break-off board. PCB is cut to size, colored black for aesthetics, 2-point headers sized and soldered on. Okay, so now most of the case components are complete. Let's start with the aesthetic mods, starting with the power supply. First, we fan swapped the Noctua NF-A9x14. Then, the rest of the PSU is masked off in preparation for painting. Rust-Oleum satin ivory silk was used. PSU was propped up on a tuna can and cardboard to allow rotating without touching it. A hairdryer between coats really helped speed up the process. Masking is removed and the PSU reassembled. On to the part I dread the most, custom cables. I had a dilemma on which sleeving to use as I felt the MDPCX Vanilla Sans was too yellow compared to the woods used. In the end, I went with cream paracord instead. Because I was using 17 gauge wire, the 3mm paracord was a tight fit and had to be slowly stretched over the wire inch by inch. The ends are heated and molded onto the crimp. I left the other end with exposed wire to reduce the material near the power supply. You'll get a better idea of this later. Y splices were done for the wires requiring 2 sources. Printed cable combs are now glued in. Using the stock cable as reference, I wired up the connectors. For the GPU, I printed a cable tray to run along its backplate. The tray and combs are printed separately, then glued together. The GPU combs have additional indents in the middle for the sense cables to run under the sleeved cables. The sleeving couldn't fit into the 12V high power connector, hence it was left out. I simply printed a cover plate to hide this. Similar tray was designed for the CPU cables. Time to chuck on some tunes and cable away. Next, I made a custom low-profile IEC cable. The tray for this was in a skeletal form to minimize airflow restrictions. The combs also used spring clips rather than glue to hold in place. Additional spacers added to support the tray against the PSU. Next, the 3 rear fans had their wires extended. I didn't want to use standard extenders as their connectors are bulky, so soldering it is. As the 4-pin fan cable can't fit through the paracord, I had to use the PET sleeving. The easy way to mount these fans would be to simply cut through holes and screw them from behind. But I thought this looked cluttered and messy. Instead, I designed and printed these nuts that would be tapped, then glued into a pocket on the fan plate, allowing a clean mounting solution. Let's give it a go. Don't forget to mask before chamfering holes in plywood. After attaching the fans, I immediately got triggered by the visible wires from the back, so I printed and painted some covers to hide them. Much better. For the bottom intake fans, I designed a dust filter to keep the PC clean. The filter body is printed with embedded magnets. Mesh is glued around the sides, excess trimmed, mesh is stretched over the face frame then glued in. With the stock rubber corners, there leaves a 1mm gap. This would reduce the efficiency of the filter and should be eliminated. After removal, the screws also sit proud of the frame. So I had to chamfer the holes to get a flush mount. Much better. Okay, I think we're ready to put this beast together. If you're enjoying it so far, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, let's get on to building. Case is flipped to install fans. Noctua's new A14 G2s going in. Top frame is removed for better access. IEC plug is screwed in. DisplayPort plate next. Rear fans slide in. Let's sort out these loose wires. Printed tray with wood veneer. Clips into a motherboard standoff, then screwed in. Tray has slots for staggered zip ties. Perfect. Fan header to power rear and top fans. PSU ladder goes through now. Cables pressed in, then connected. Some accent pieces added to the motherboard. I didn't like the yellow PCB edge. Paper to protect the bottom panel. Let's run more cabling. Each cable is tensioned to get the same bend on the front. CPU up next. It's hard to explain how satisfying it feels to click these cables in place. But have a listen. GPU PCB was also colored. Then carefully positioned and held with 7 screws. DisplayPort adapter. I like how this card has screw points here, almost as if it was designed for a cable tray. A little logo cover to cap it off. Power supply next. It was a challenge plugging in the connectors as there wasn't much excess cable. You can see why I left these ends unsleeved for maximum flexibility. AC plugs in and the unit can be screwed on. The exposed cables were hidden with a printed magnetic shroud. Finally, the extension cable for the bottom fan is pressed in. I took some time to adjust each cable to get even spacing between them. Some grommets to cover the larger openings. To hide the cable pass-through, a birch plate was cut then engraved. I used painter's tape, clear coat, then black paint to get super sharp lines. An indent was machined to mate with the plexi cover, giving a flush finish. Noctua U12A installed onto the Ryzen 7700. I noticed the fans had some serial numbers along the front, so I wiped them away with some spirits. Each fan's logo would also be upside down when mounted on the cooler. I could not accept this, so I cut and machined super thin strips of birch, soaked them in water, then taped on a coffee jar to dry. Resulting curved pieces stuck on to hide the upside down logos. The fan header area looks kinda messy, so let's fix it. A small piece of jar was cut, then carved, steamed, and bent into shape. Printed end plates hold its form and houses magnets for attachment. Back to the top frame. Power button cable routed between both fans before screwing in. I then noticed the fan hub sticker wasn't perfectly level, so low iron glass slots in. Front glass is temporarily held with tape. Top back on. Don't forget to cover the wires. To allow easy access to I/O while keeping the case sealed, Brush strips were printed with TPU along with 2 PLA holders. These multi-height quad-row brushes allow cables to pass through while ensuring minimal dust is drawn in. To plug something in, top off, thread through, top back on, done. Last but not least, magnetic fan filters click in. Let me know which detail of this build is your favorite. And with that, the build is complete. During full load, the CPU sits at 77 degrees and a GPU at 68. This is with CPU fans at 1500 RPM and case fans around 1000. The noise generated is noticeable but not too loud. During gaming, the system is very quiet and the temperatures do not exceed 60 degrees. What do you guys think? Did I do Noctua justice with this PC? Let me know down in the comments below. The 3D files for this project is also available on my Etsy, linked in the description below. I'll be posting more detailed shots of this build on my Instagram, so make sure to follow me there if you're interested. As always, thank you for watching to the end of this very long video. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next one.